Anger is a powerful emotion that can often arise in response to the actions or words of others, right? We all know that. It's a natural reaction to feeling threatened, mistreated, or wronged in some way. No big news there. But one of the primary reasons we get angry with others is because we condemn them for their behavior or actions. We condemn them. And when we condemn someone, we're essentially passing judgment on them and finding fault with what they've done. And this can trigger feelings of anger as we perceive their actions as being harmful, unfair, unjust, etc. And our reaction may be fueled by a sense of righteousness or a desire to see justice served. We might seek revenge, etc. Furthermore, our anger towards others can be a reflection of our own values and beliefs. So, when someone behaves in a way that contradicts our principles, we may feel a sense of moral outrage, a strong reaction to what we perceive as a violation of our moral standards, as if we are morally superior. I got news for you. Your spouse can't make you mad, sad, glad, happy, resentful. He or she can't make you spit, can't make you stand on your head. They don't have that kind of power. So, when you're on your moral high horse and get angry and condemn them, just know that it's going to backfire, it's going to come back around, and you're going to end up shooting yourself in the butt.
A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high-function autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So, a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and that's due to three different things, really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem. But if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individuals' inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavior rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point. And I want to take a look at what's really behind the anger that you witness in your autistic spouse, because there's always something behind the curtain. The only thing you see is anger, but there's a bunch of other stuff going on that's the core issue. We'll look at each of these in turn. It could be anxiety, emotional vulnerability, grief or depression, hurt, low self-esteem, powerlessness, and even fear. So we'll look at each of these in turn. Anger hides anxiety, okay? Our bodies interpret anger as a threat to survival, and as a result, we release adrenaline and noradrenaline to help us cope. Now, these hormones act as an analgesic. In fact, anger makes us feel better in the short term because it numbs our emotional and physical discomfort, but that's not a healthy long-term solution. So people on the autism spectrum should not allow themselves to get addicted to this kind of painkiller. If they do, then outbursts of anger may become a way of life. And unfortunately, for too many people, in this case spouses on the autism spectrum, anger has already become a way of life. Anger also hides emotional vulnerability. Some people on the autism spectrum use anger as a way to distance themselves from their NT spouse. Perhaps they feel safer if their spouse is held at arm's length, or maybe they find it hard to express their true personal needs and desires. Anger also hides grief and depression. It's very common for people on the autism spectrum to respond to grief and depression by getting angry. And this is their way of coping with the pain that they're feeling. And the reason that they would opt for anger instead of feeling grief is because anger is less painful. Anger also hides hurt. Admitting that we feel hurt is too much for some of us. It's almost better to explode in rage than to show we care or that we're upset by whatever's happened. So hurt hides behind anger when you feel unloved, rejected, or criticized. And many people on the autism spectrum remember those high school days and all the teasing, harassment, bullying, rejection, and so on. And they have carried that childhood anger into adulthood. Anger also hides low self-esteem. A person on the spectrum who's been experiencing anger control issues for many years may admit to himself, if not to others, that he sometimes struggles with self-esteem issues. He may have internal dialogues that revolve around themes like, any minute now somebody will see that I'm useless or I'm stupid or a complete fraud or not good enough and so on. And sometimes these feelings of shame are just too painful to bear, and a less painful emotion would be anger. Anger hides powerlessness. If we go through life feeling weak, hopeless, helpless, overlooked, or undervalued, anger often hides these feelings of powerlessness. And lastly, anger hides fear. The most common feeling that hides behind anger is definitely fear, but unless we're developing a habit of mindfulness, which is making ourselves aware of our emotions as they arise, it can be difficult to identify the emotions lurking beneath our anger. Our best indication of what those emotions may be is to consider how we feel about ourselves at the times when we are not feeling angry. So those are the 7 big things that really go on behind the anger. What you see is anger, but what's going on behind the anger can be anxiety, emotional vulnerability, grief or depression, hurt, low self-esteem, powerlessness, or fear. We want to look at 3 anger styles in autism spectrum disorder level 1, and they would be fight, flight, or pretend. With the fighters, it's anger turned to aggression. And the fighters are pretty simple to recognize because they can be very verbally abusive and parental. Some of the characteristics would be uncontrollable fits of rage. They seem to have emotional diarrhea and let it out all the time. They can be openly and often defiant of requests from their spouse. They often feel that their spouse's opinions and perspectives and rules are stupid and don't apply to them. They may often demean or swear directly at their spouse. They may make threats, and these individuals are largely cynical and negative in general. The flighters would be described as anger turned to passive responses. Now, the flighters can also be fairly simple to recognize because they're passive. They don't fight back when confronted, and often they will opt for a shutdown rather than a meltdown. And some of the traits that you may witness if you're dealing with a flighter would be they tend to spend a lot of time alone, they seem withdrawn, they seem to hold anger in, they show very little emotion, they appear depressed, they seem emotionally constipated, they also may have numerous physical problems, headaches, muscle aches, upset stomach, and other physical symptoms that result from holding it in. They may simply go along with whatever the other spouse requests just to avoid conflict. They also may have few friends outside of work-related friendships. They may blame themselves unnecessarily. They'll often live life as a loner and engage in solitary activities for extended periods of time. They will hold their anger in and hold it and hold it and hold it and then blow up suddenly and violently. They'll also have difficulty expressing emotions, and sometimes they're so extremely passive they will tend to get walked on by others. They don't engage in much conversation, and they deal with difficult emotions by cutting the emotions off. The flighters are in danger of destroying themselves emotionally from within. They're kind of like a balloon being constantly blown into with no release valve. When they explode, their anger may be exceedingly verbally abusive, but then they recover quickly once they've blown off that negative energy. The pretenders can be described as anger silently planning revenge. And perhaps the most difficult to detect is this particular anger style, because the individual seems to be calm on the surface, but he or she is raging, scheming, and planning underneath. So they are very passive-aggressive, with emphasis on aggressive. Now, these individuals don't directly confront the anger as a fighter would. They will tend to be passive and appear to accept what is said, and then will disregard what is said to do their own thing. So in this regard, they're kind of sneaky. And they may even go unnoticed because they're so sneaky. They often lack the courage to be direct, and they often become very skilled at being deceitful. They kind of know where the back door to revenge is and will use it often. Some of the specific traits would be they tend to sabotage, they tend to avoid direct conflict while creating problems in other areas, sneaky behaviors, they often get caught in lies, they may not admit mistakes, they become very good at blaming others and are convinced in their mind that the other person is 100% at fault. And you will also witness a lot of inconsistency between what is said and what is done. So in dealing with an autistic spouse, the first step would be to identify the preferred anger style. The next step then would be, if your spouse is willing to cooperate with you, to do a little analysis to look for triggers to their preferred anger style. In this way, you can avoid the triggers when possible. If the trigger can't be avoided, then both you and your autistic spouse can be on high alert that you're engaging in a particular situation or circumstance or conversation where you're at high risk for experiencing one of those anger styles. And so in those cases, an extra dose of grace and mercy and compassion and understanding would be in order. So in working with neurodiverse couples, both the NT spouse and the ASD spouse, I have run into, for many years now, this thing where there's basically 3 different anger styles. And usually the spouse will exhibit one more so than the other 2. So the first one we're going to call the knee-jerk reactor. Now this spouse goes from 0 to 100 just like that. They're easily and quickly triggered and they go off instantly, repeatedly, over even small infractions. That's the knee-jerk reactor. Then we have what I'm going to call the stuffer exploder. This person stuffs their feelings. Something's frustrating, they stuff it. Something angers them, they don't say anything. Something is annoying as hell, and they try to sweep it under the rug. Anything to keep the peace, and they stuff and they stuff and they stuff, and then they explode. Big time. Then they feel guilty for exploding and go back to stuffing again. Then we have the stuffer imploder. This individual will stuff their feelings, sweep it under the rug, anything to keep the peace, on and on and on and on, and they never explode. Rather, they implode, and that implosion is depression. Okay, so we have the knee-jerk reactor, the stuffer exploder, and the stuffer imploder. Which one are you? Would you like to schedule a paid private coaching session? This will be in the form of a face-to-face Zoom call. Underneath any of my videos, you'll see this Calendly link. If you click on that link, it'll open up my calendar. You can pick the available days and times that works for your schedule. You'll get a follow-up email immediately after purchasing a session that will have the Zoom link that coincides with the day and time that you picked. I will get an email too that you scheduled a session, and I will be available on that exact day and time, and we will talk. I look forward to working with you. Hey guys, this is Mark. Click on the join button underneath any of my videos, then click on members only videos, and then click on join. And for $9.99 a month, you'll have access to members only videos, which are excerpts from previous workshops I've conducted for NT partners, ASD partners, and the neurodiverse couple. New videos will be uploaded weekly.